أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر ولله الحمد.
Hello everyone and welcome to Conversations about Beauty and Islamic Theology, a series where we explore the rich and diverse intersections between theology, art and mysticism. Now today it is our absolute pleasure to host Professor Seyyed Hossein Nasr. Professor Seyyed Hossein Nasr is University Professor of Islamic Studies at George Washington University. Author of over 50 books, Professor Nasr's career as a teacher and scholar spans over 5 decades. He is a highly respected intellectual figure in multiple fields, including, but not limited to, Islamic studies, Islamic philosophy, and Islamic history. Now, today we hope to explore some of the ideas that emerge at the intersections of these fields and art, and turn to some of the engaging and original ideas that are found in Professor Nasr's writings on traditional Islamic art. Professor Nasr, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to speak to a young Muslim scholar who's interested seriously in our tradition, whatever aspect of it is, and especially in the question of art, this relation to religion and what in Western language is called theology, because you try to translate theology into kalam. Kalam is not the place in Islamic thought to look for the principles of Islamic art. But anyway, theological in the English Western sense of it is a very important subject. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you a few minutes on this matter, therefore.
Thank you so much. So Professor Nasr, maybe I can ask a kind of broader question, which is that your work on Islamic art and architecture opened a new horizon of understanding in terms of the meanings that Islamic art embodies and expresses. So can I ask, what was it that initially led you to see Islamic art as a reflection of certain immutable principles?
There are two different elements that I have to discuss. One is the experience of Islamic art from my childhood. I was born in Tehran in 1933. I saw a lot of what remained of the tradition there. I was taken to Isfahan when I was a young child. And this direct experience of Islamic art was very significant in imprinting upon my mind the significance and beauty of our artistic tradition. And I was also brought up in a home in which, besides the carpets, because they had excellent Persian carpets, and they're one of the few remaining masterpieces of Islamic art that survive in many homes to this day, but a lot of works of Islamic art. And also, my father was very keen that I learned calligraphy, and I had years and years of practice of calligraphy as the one Islamic art, which I know a little bit about, like my handwriting is not too bad, but I had this experience not only of thinking about it, but also doing it, one of the major Islamic arts of calligraphy. The second, which is the second factor, completely different from this, is that when I came to the West, I went for many years to prep school or the preparatory school, private school in the middle of New Jersey, the Petty School. And once you drove from there to New York, you went through some of the most ugly industrial areas of northern New Jersey at that time, and the ugliness of the modern world. I just use it very plain. The ugliness of not everything in the modern world, because tree is not part of the modern world, but exists in our modern times. But what modern world created the ugliness, which is really unprecedented in human history, left a deep impression upon me. And I became very much interested in beauty. It was in my nature, but also the study of beauty meant. This remained potential until I came to MIT. And MIT has some of the ugliest interior buildings in the world. Bars sticking out of dark corridors with glass windows, and it was the epitome of a lack of beauty, you might say, in the ambience, in contrast to Tübingen. The medieval people understood that a beautiful ambience was very important for studies. That's why the medieval universities in both Islamic world, like the madrasas and Qarawiyin, let's say in Fez, which is older than Tübingen, uh, is very, very beautiful, as is Tübingen. But here was just the reverse. And so I had a feeling of suffocation. And I was a student at MIT doing extremely well in studying physics and mathematics. But this is part of the stifling atmosphere is the lack of beauty. Until I discovered in my sophomore years the writings of Ananda Kumaraswamy, great Indian art historian, who opened my eyes to traditional art besides many things, along with René Guénon and Friedrich Schwann to the whole traditional world. But I discovered my own world. I discovered my own intellectual world. But a very important part of the intellectual world was art. And I had the fortune of being able to gain access to the Kumaraswamy library. Mrs. Kumaraswamy was still alive. She took a liking to me, and I cataloged and many of the works of the Kumaraswamy library. I would go and work for her, but in exchange, I could read those books, and I discovered all these works on traditional art, Hindu art, Buddhist art. There was very little Islamic art at that time, but traditional art became a great love of mine. And I began to take courses at Harvard with Benjamin Rowland, who has been a student of Ananda Kumaraswamy. I'm a professor of Oriental art, but taught it from a traditional point of view, which is very remarkable. You don't have someone at Harvard right now like that. At that time, it was remarkable, Western University. And you felt that Kumaraswamy was teaching this course. I took several courses with him on Hindu art, on Buddhist art, on Chinese art. And I know a little bit about this art. So that was a physics major at MIT down Mass Avenue, away from Harvard. But it sort of began from there. But then my interest grew more and more in Islamic art. And I discovered the writings of Titus Burkhardt, and I later met him. Kumaraswamy, although he referred to Islamic art, didn't write much about Islamic art per se. He presented the principle. I met him, and Friedrich Schwann had written his incredible pages about the principle of Islamic art. And then, although I was born a Persian, I began to travel in other parts of the Islamic world, even as a graduate student. I went to Morocco and other places and gained first-hand knowledge of much of Islamic art and architecture, besides going, of course, to the British Museum, to Metropolitan Museum. That goes without saying. But even traveling to the parts of the Islamic world, especially Morocco, which is at that time, even now, is one of the great centers of traditional Islamic art and architecture. Sultan Hassan did render a great service by paying attention to the subject, and many schools of traditional art were revived in Morocco. It's really incredible what they did. Many of the old mosques were repaired, madrasas were repaired. Anyway, so I came to in 1958 to Iran. In a sense, and although I became professor of philosophy at Tehran University and history of science and teaching what is my main field, philosophy, intellectual thought, and so forth, I, from the very beginning, I had very, very keen interest in art and also in the philosophy of art, because I'd read the works of Burkhardt. Burkhardt became a very close friend of mine. It was like my father. We met from morning to night when we would meet together in Lausanne. We traveled together to Damascus. We visited Tomb of Arabi together. I was very close to him, very, very close to him. And so I began to experience again the great masterpieces of Islamic art in Iran. And during the 20 years when I was professor at Tehran University, before I was exiled by the Iranian Revolution, not only was I very intellectually active, very in the intellectual field of philosophy, theology, and so forth, theology in the Western sense, that is religious thought, let's say. Because I said, if you translate theology by kalam, you really delimit its connotation, and I don't want to do that. But so I don't use theology in that sense often. But anyway, not only that, but I found a protector and patron for the arts in the new queen of Iran who had just married the Shah after I went back to Iran, Queen Farah. She had been studying architecture in Paris, or the Western architecture, but she had innately an interest in art. And I came to know her very early after her marriage. I was still a young uh, professor, second year I was in Iran. For the next 19 years, I collaborated very closely with her help. You cannot imagine how many buildings we saved, how what we did for the revival, not only of architecture, but of the crafts, of tile, of calligraphy, of bookbinding, 1,001 different arts that were dying out. The last few masters left with the last gasp of breath in Isfahan or someplace like that. And we did a lot to bring about a revival of the traditional arts. What you see in Iran today in certain fields, although there's a lot of ugliness that goes on. Tehran has sprawled like all the big cities of the world, and this is done with Islamic art. But a lot of wonderful vernacular Islamic architecture is being built. A lot of nice mosques, tile work, a revival of calligraphy. A lot of things. These things go back to what we planted. Really, the tree that we planted with the help of the Queen in the 1960s and 70s in Iran.
Professor, thank you so much for illuminating this discussion with your personal journey. And you touched upon Islamic intellectual and religious thought and this broader definition of theology. The ideas in Islamic intellectual thought, like philosophy, the broader definition of theology or mysticism, which can help us to understand Islamic art and architecture, the meanings or the form.
First of all, as I said, if we understand by theology kalam, not much. And even the Sharia sets the conditions for Islamic art, not the principles. The principles of Islamic art come from the Quran, the haqiqah, not the Sharia, but the haqiqah, which is the origin of both the Sharia and Islamic art. Islamic art is the complement of the Sharia as the crystallization of the message of the Quran. Islamic art is not accidentally Islamic. It has its roots very deeply in the Quran, and those principles were elucidated most of all in Islamic civilization by the Sufis. I've said that many times in lectures. Oftentimes people ask me, what is the most important book we can read on the philosophy of Islamic art, traditional book? I said, the Masnavi of Jalaluddin Rumi. It has many other things in it, but incredible verses that deal with the significance of beauty, of form, how form makes one transcend the scales of being, and all the most profound things about art, and many other Sufis, many other Sufis. The Islamic philosophers, in the earlier philosophers, such as Farabi, Ibn Sina, Al-Kindi, and before them, they did not deal so much with art directly. There is no chapter on classical Islamic philosophical books on art per se. The word, even the term philosophy of art, is not an Islamic, Arabic, or Persian term. We may now use it in these languages, but it's not traditional. However, the discussion of very important principles are there. For example, the question of form. Traditional art has to do with form. Form is extremely significant. A discussion of form philosophically by Ibn Sina, Surah, wal Madda or Hayula, the form and matter and so forth, are very significant in later discussions that we have philosophically about Islamic art. But then later on, with the school of illumination, the school of Ishraq, the wedding between intellectual philosophical discourse and art become more intimate. And also you begin to get a number of figures for both philosophers and poets, which is very rare. In the West, you cannot name one famous philosopher who was also a good poet. Can you? No. But in Islam, Besides, of course, the famous Khayyam, you have Afzaluddin Kashani, one of the greatest philosophers at the same time poets, and there are many others, including people like Sohrawardi and Ibn wrote poetry. Especially Sohrawardi, you begin to get a development of a philosophy of art, which is very, very important. In his case, couched in the language of Nur, of light, because school of illumination, which is very profound. And this then weds, it becomes wedded to what the various Sufis say. But let me give you an example. Besides the Masnavi of Rumi, we have this incredible work of Sheikh Mahmud Shabastari from the 8th, 14th century called Gulshan Raz, Secret Garden of Divine Mysteries. This is a translation of the Garden of Divine Mysteries. Gulshan Raz, which is one of my very favorite texts of Sufism, which is in Persian, and which has been translated several times. I'm now written a commentary myself, a contemporary commentary, which will come out soon on it. I've translated it myself. I've taught it for 20, 30 years in Persia and also sometimes to English audiences when I was exiled. But anyway, it will come out soon, inshallah. That book, besides being one of the masterpieces of metaphysics and spirituality, is also a remarkable work on the philosophy of art and of beauty. He has a whole section on beauty. And he ends the book with something which is unique in this explicitness and profundity. And that is the spiritual beauty of the features of a woman, of her face, of her eyes, of her hair, of the curl of her hair, of the mole on her forehead, and so forth and so on. Is unbelievable, really unbelievable how beautiful that is. And there it relates beauty to not human art, but to God's art of creating woman. But the idea of beauty, which he expresses, is very, very significant for the understanding of Islamic art. And all of these, to conclude this part of the discussion, of course, are based on the basic Quranic teaching that God is the creator of all things. And God loves ihsan. And ihsan comes from the word husn, which means both beauty and goodness. That is the depth of the Islamic understanding of it. That is, goodness is never separated from beauty. That's the difference with Christianity, where, of course, the Middle Ages, the two were right there, but today, Catholics emphasize goodness without beauty. They build the ugliest churches. That's not important. As long as the mass is held there and people are good and don't steal or something like that. In Islam, the very term includes both. Husn. Husn means beauty, Jamal. And then more explicitly, you have the hadith, Allahu Jamirun yuhibbu Jamal, which you know well. God himself is beautiful. Jamal is one of the 99 names of God. In the West, you don't think of God as the beautiful, even if you're aesthete, even if you love beauty. But Islam, there it is. It's the hadith of the Prophet. It's one of the 99 names of God. And that is why yuhibbu Jamal, he loves beauty. And therefore expects of us to do everything that we do with husn, which means with beauty, as well as with goodness. In the traditional Muslim mind, the two are never separated from each other.
Thank you so much, Professor. And as a final question, we spoke earlier about traditional arts, and you've been a great supporter of the traditional arts through the years. I was wondering if you could perhaps give some advice to people who are seeking to return to traditional arts? And do you think it's important to read texts like the Masnavi in order to inform and inspire artistic practice?
Yes, I have very concrete advice. First of all, stop having an inferiority complex. Stop emulating the modern Western idea that art has to be according to the values of its time, without ever asking what do the values of those times have to be according to. Within that, even in the West, of course, you have, for example, the continuation of Gothic style up to the 20th century Washington National Cathedral, outside of which looks like a 13th century cathedral. So alhamdulillah, that had died out completely. But by and large, because of the Western idea, they always say 18th century art, 17th century art, Northern European 16th century art, and try to locate things by time and geography and based on kind of humanistic understanding of art. And we should go beyond that. That is, we have traditional art and we have modern non-traditional art. Traditional Islamic art is a permanent reality, except, of course, it's not identical, it's not simply repetition. Seljuk art does not look identical with Ayyubid art. But as soon as someone from Scandinavia is brought to see both of them, is say, yes, they belong to the same civilization, obviously. So the important thing is to be contemporary without being modern in art. So therefore, to relearn the principles in all different arts, and they have not all died out. This is one field that, despite all of the tragedies that have befallen the Islamic world and continue to do so, and despite the weaknesses that we see every day, there's one field in which there is a glimmer of hope. This is precisely the field of art and architecture. Today, there are more people trained even and interested in traditional architecture in the Islamic world than there were 50, 60 years ago. When Hassan Fatih was building for the poor people along the Nile River and the government didn't want him to do that, they refused to allow people to live in those houses because the houses are too beautiful, too cheap. The government agents could not steal any money from it. I'm being very frank. I'm not trying to criticize Egyptians. It could have been Iranians or Turks or anyone else. We're sharing these things together. But now, look at his students, Abdul Wahid al-Wakil, Omar Farouk, people like that, very well recognized architects, and even in countries of Saudi Arabia, where Wahhabism is totally blind to art, or it's totally indifferent to the aspect of beauty of the Islamic revelation. They commissioned him to build all the beautiful little mosques along the Corniche. And the Qiblatain Mosque, which was torn down, unfortunately, all Qiblatain at the time of the Prophet, astaghfirullah. But at least what they built in his place is very beautiful, built by him, Abdul Wahid al-Wakil. So, alhamdulillah, there's something positive going on. And young architects, people your age, they should not lose hope. On the one hand, they should read the critiques of modern Western art by traditionalists. Why is it cut off from the spiritual world? Why art in the modern world has no point of reference beyond the psyche of the artist? Really, the subjectivism of the artist. They even go one step beyond painting the street, purely realistic art of before the 19th century. It's gone beyond that. To study all of those things, and on the other hand, to turn to Islamic tradition itself, and you have to be aware that you're not alone in this. The city of Ankara, the capital of Turkey, created by Kemal Atatürk, who turned his back on all the traditions of Islam and was against, in fact, Islamic things so much it changed our holiday from Friday to Sunday in Turkey, changed the alphabet from Arabic Persian into Latin. I mean, very, very crucial matters. Did not allow mosques to be built in Ankara for a long time. When I used to lead delegates to Ankara from Iran in the 1960s, there were no notable mosques. There were little mosques here and there, but inconsequential. Now, look what's happened. People criticize Erdogan, but look at all the positive things. They're beautiful mosques. They're all Ottoman style. They are not of the 19th century, but they show the continuity of the art. In the same way, if you travel in Turkey, you see 17th century Ottoman mosque, you see 18th century, 19th century, you feel you're in the same world. And they follow the same principle, but they're not identical because local conditions may have changed in one way or another. So you have these very, very important events taking place, and one should not lose hope, but it's a great battle to be carried out. When the national mosque of the biggest Islamic country, Indonesia, was designed originally by a European Christian architect who had turned against Christianity. I know nothing at all about Islamic art. I would say nothing about his mental state. Leave that in God's hand. Look at the result of it. Let me conclude by telling you the story. I was the only time I was in Indonesia. I was on a private visit. I didn't want to be the government. Because after the revolution, I was a private person. Before that, of course, I had the rank of ambassador and so forth. And everywhere I went, I had to make contact with various people. Here I was on my own. I'd gone with one of my students to visit Indonesia. Of course, they knew about me and they received me very well. The last day I was about to leave Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Indonesia, Jakarta, the Minister of Arts and Culture of Indonesia, Tirmidhi Tahir, asked to see me. I first said, what do I want to visit the minister for? I've nothing to do with it. I said, no, please, it's demanding. And I said, all right. So I went to meet him for an hour. We had a wonderful discussion together, unbelievable. And he said, what advice do you have to give us for preserving the traditional architecture of our country? I said, first it was to tear down the National Mosque in Jakarta. And he laughed. And so he went like that. That's the world we live in. We have a jihad in our hand, a spiritual jihad. But my final advice to you as a young both scholar and practitioner of Islamic art, and all people like you, women and men alike, and the women have been playing a very important role these days, is the famous saying, be true to thyself, to thine own self be true. Be true to the heritage that you have. Very, very rich artistic heritage. Islam had produced one of the richest heritages in all fields of art practically, except sculpture, which was done in this world Islamic perspective. But putting that aside, even painting in the form of miniatures, some of the great paintings of the world, architecture, bookbinding, and then of course, what's the West called minor arts, which are in fact very major art, with objects that surround us, from carpets to bronze to brick to clothing to all kinds of things. It produced one of the richest artistic traditions of the world, and we are heirs to it. And we are as much responsible before God for its preservation as we are for the preservation of what considered to be his religion. That's true, of course. The Quran, the Hadith comes from that, but also that religion includes actually the artistic heritage which God has made available to us. When a Muslim sees the heart of Islam destroyed by greed, by having 100-story buildings built around it, you can charge pilgrims $1,500 a night in the name of helping the pilgrims, and you've destroyed the whole ambience of the heart of Islam, which is now been done. The Kaaba has become little things like a minute. If you go to the 90th floor, the clock around there is much bigger than the if you stand on the ground of the Kaaba, practically. And the clock tells you what time it is. Whether when you're in a Kaaba, you're to forget what time it is. It could be an eternity with God. And so the befuddling, mind-boggling errors of our world, despite all of that, we must have courage. And in this one field, at least, things have got somewhat better. I've been in this royal battle for 60 years, both at the practical level and intellectual level. And training students writing, but also, as I said, meeting great masters in Isfahan and Yazd and Kashan and bringing students to them so that the tradition will continue and so forth. And I can tell you that although two of the great patrons of Islamic art, Sultan Hassan and the Queen of Iran, are no longer around. One has died and one is no longer in power. But more and more, a lot of Islamic leaders, including, for example, Imran Khan, who is now Prime Minister of Pakistan, they realize the significance of Islamic art and how important that is. And for example, in Turkey, the government is now taking very seriously, permitting the revival of different Islamic arts and encouraging it. So it's not hopeless, and let's pray to God that this great heritage that He has given us, which is very, very precious, for us to create a world in which the reality of Islam is present. It's not only an abstract idea, but persists.
Professor, thank you so much for that really powerful and motivating message. I think it's a great way to end the discussion. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your patience, and for speaking us today. It's been a real honor to speak to you today.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to speak to a young Muslim who's interested in serious things. I'd like to dedicate to that, and until I'm towards the end of it, but as long as I have a breath, I shall do so.
May God give you a long life, inshallah. Ameen.